On April 7, 1945, over Tokyo Bay, Japanese naval aviator Lieutenant Saburo Sakai witnessed a scene that contradicted long-standing assumptions about the Pacific Air War. From the cockpit of his Mitsubishi Zero, he saw American fighter aircraft flying high above the Japanese capital's single-engine machines operating far beyond what Japanese planners believed possible. They were not the familiar twin-boom P-38 Lightnings that had occasionally appeared at extreme range. These were more numerous, more streamlined, and clearly capable of sustained operations over Japan itself. At roughly 25,000 feet, dozens of silver fighters with bubble canopies circled above a large formation of B-29 Superfortress bombers. For years, Japanese authorities had insisted that American single-engine fighters could not reach the home islands due to fuel limitations and the vast distances involved. Yet nearly 100 of these aircraft now escorted bombers directly over Tokyo, demonstrating that those calculations were no longer valid. The aircraft Sakai observed represented a turning point in the balance of air power. The flight distance from Iwo Jima to Tokyo was about 750 miles, meaning a round-trip mission of roughly 1,500 miles over open ocean. Such endurance, combined with combat time over heavily defended territory, had previously been considered unattainable for fighter aircraft. However, the North American P-51D Mustang, equipped with a Packard-built Merlin engine and external fuel tanks, had made it achievable. This capability removed one of Japan's last geographic defenses. The psychological consequences for Japanese pilots were significant. The idea that the home islands were shielded by distance had been central to Japanese planning. That confidence began to erode after U.S. forces landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. Although small, only about 8 square miles, the island lay roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo. To American strategists, it offered a forward base from which long-range fighters could escort bombers to and from Japan. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted over a month and resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. More than 680 Americans were killed and over 19,000 wounded, while nearly all of the island's approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders died. Even before the island was fully secured, U.S. engineers began expanding captured airfields. On March 6, 1,945 P-51 Mustangs from the 15th Fighter Group landed there. Conditions were primitive. Pilots and ground crews dug defensive positions while Japanese holdouts still conducted attacks from caves. Facilities were minimal, and operations took place amid volcanic ash, sulfur fumes, and ongoing combat nearby. Commanders understood that Iwo Jima would enable missions never before attempted. The 7th Fighter Command trained specifically for long-range escort operations between the island and Japan. These sorties required hours of navigation over open water, combat above heavily defended targets, and a return flight with no intermediate landing options. Mission durations could exceed 8 hours, and any mechanical failure meant likely loss at sea. The P-51D Mustang made these missions possible. Known for its aerodynamic wing design, efficient cooling system, and powerful Merlin engine producing nearly 1,700 horsepower, the aircraft combined speed with exceptional range. Internal fuel capacity was supplemented by a fuselage tank and, crucially, by detachable external tanks under the wings. With two 110-gallon drop tanks, the Mustang's range could approach 1,600 miles, allowing it to escort bombers to Tokyo and back with careful fuel management. The external tanks themselves were a major industrial achievement. Built from lightweight metal and designed to be discarded before combat, they extended range without permanently increasing drag or weight. By 1945, American factories were producing them in large quantities at relatively low cost. Japan lacked a comparable system. Its fighters were designed primarily for shorter interception missions and had limited access to effective auxiliary fuel tanks. Many of the pilots assigned to Iwo Jima had limited experience in the P-51 before deployment. They had to adapt quickly under demanding conditions. The island remained dangerous even after its capture, with sporadic attacks from remaining Japanese troops. Ground crews worked long hours in harsh environments to keep aircraft operational. Early missions focused on supporting ground forces and conducting shorter operations to nearby islands, allowing pilots to practice navigation and fuel management over the ocean. By early April 1945, multiple fighter groups were operating from Iwo Jima, capable of launching large escort formations. Preparations intensified for the first full-scale long-range missions to Tokyo. On April 6, pilots attended briefings outlining routes, fuel calculations, and weather considerations. The next day, they would undertake flights that demonstrated the new reach of American fighter power and confirmed that Japan's geographic isolation no longer provided protection from sustained aerial escort operations. On paper, the mission plan looked simple. In practice, it carried enormous risk. The fighters were ordered to head north-northwest for roughly 3 hours at 10,000 feet, keeping tight formation and carefully managing fuel. Their task was to meet B-29 bombers from the 73rd Bomb Wing about 20 miles south of Tokyo, escort them during the strike, confront enemy aircraft if necessary, and then make the long return flight. Briefings did not hide the dangers. The round trip would stretch to nearly 1,500 miles, keeping pilots in their cockpits for at least 8 hours. There were no backup airfields along the route. Any serious mechanical failure would likely force a ditching in the Pacific, where rescue efforts would face vast distances and uncertain outcomes. Returning safely to Iwo Jima depended almost entirely on disciplined fuel management. Every gallon mattered. Pilots had to monitor instruments constantly, fly smoothly, and avoid aggressive maneuvering until their external tanks were released. Losing contact with the formation could be deadly, as navigating over open ocean offered no visual reference points. On the night of April 6, ground crews worked non-stop to prepare 96 P-51D Mustangs for the unprecedented sortie. Each aircraft underwent detailed inspections, engines were tuned, fuel systems checked repeatedly, and 110-gallon drop tanks mounted under the wings. Internal tanks were filled, ammunition loaded, 1,880 rounds of .50 caliber and oxygen systems tested. A single mechanical issue could determine whether a pilot lived or died. Dawn broke clear and cold on April 7, 1945. At 700 hours, pilots began pre-flight preparations, layering clothing for extreme temperatures at altitude, which could drop near 40° FF. They wore flight suits, life preservers, parachutes, and survival gear. Each carried rations, water, signal flares, and shark repellent. Survival after ditching in the Pacific was unlikely, but preparation offered a slim chance. By 745, engines roared to life across Iwo Jima's airfields. The distinctive sound of Packard-built Merlin engines echoed over the island. Pilots ran final checks: full fuel, oxygen flow, radio communication, secure drop tanks, operational gun sights, and properly set trim. At precisely 800, the first group of 4 Mustangs departed. Within 20 minutes, all 96 fighters were airborne, forming into flights, squadrons, and larger groups before turning toward Tokyo. The long approach demanded constant attention. Flying in close formation for 3 hours required steady throttle control to avoid excessive fuel burn. Pilots maintained exact altitude, speed, and spacing while climbing on oxygen and watching gauges without interruption: fuel flow, oil pressure, coolant temperature. A B-29 flew ahead as a navigation leader, using its advanced equipment to guide the fighters across the featureless Pacific. Below them stretched only water in every direction. With no ships or land in sight, some pilots imagined mechanical problems, a psychological effect of long overwater flights. Minor changes in engine sound sparked anxiety. Should they turn back or press on? Such doubts were common during that first mission. About 2 hours into the flight, pilots began using fuel from the fuselage tank behind the cockpit. When full, this tank shifted the center of gravity rearward, making the aircraft sluggish and harder to control. Burning this fuel first improved handling before combat. As the tank emptied, the Mustangs gradually regained their agility. After roughly 2 hours and 45 minutes, land finally appeared. The Japanese coastline came into view, with Mount Fuji clearly visible in the distance. For many pilots, it was a striking confirmation that they had reached the enemy's homeland some 750 miles from Iwo Jima. single-engine American fighters had made the journey. Near the rendezvous point south of Tokyo, the Mustangs linked up with the bombers. A formation of 103 B-29 seconds stacked between 12,000 and 18,000 feet, assembled for the strike. Each bomber was enormous, capable of carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. Circling them were the 96 P-51 escorts, their polished metal surfaces reflecting the sun. Crossing the Japanese coast, Mustang pilots released their external tanks. Hundreds of gallons of fuel dropped away, and the aircraft immediately felt lighter and more responsive. Now configured for combat, the P-51D could exceed 430 mph and maneuver freely. Japanese defenders were about to face a new kind of threat. Radar stations in Japan detected the incoming formation but were puzzled. B-29 seconds were expected, but reports of numerous single-engine fighters caused confusion. Operators rechecked their equipment, suspecting errors. Fighters from that distance seemed impossible. Yet the radar returns were clear, and reports moved up the command chain, meeting skepticism at each level. At 10:45, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai received orders to scramble. At 29, he was among Japan's most experienced pilots, credited with more than 60 victories. He had fought across the Pacific and survived severe injuries, including a head wound that blinded one eye. Confident and seasoned, he climbed into his Mitsubishi Zero, expecting to face carrier-based American fighters. The idea that land-based American Mustangs could reach Tokyo seemed beyond belief. By the final stage of development, Japan's famous Zero fighter had evolved into the A6M5 Model 52, a version shaped by years of gradual refinements rather than a complete redesign. This model carried a heavier weapons package, two 20mm cannons alongside a pair of 13mm machine guns, and was powered by a Nakajima Sakai engine generating roughly 1,130 horsepower. At altitude, it could reach about 351 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Despite these upgrades, its defining strength remained exceptional agility, especially at lower speeds where it could outmaneuver most Allied aircraft. Japanese training doctrine, established early in the war, emphasized exploiting that advantage. Draw opponents into tight turns, rely on maneuverability, and secure the kill. For several years, that approach proved highly effective. By 1945, however, the situation was changing. As Saburo Sakai climbed through 10,000 feet over Japan, he noticed a massive incoming formation. The scale of the raid quickly became clear: more than 100 B-29 bombers with a large escort of fighters. The escort aircraft were single-engine types, but they did not resemble Hellcats or Corsairs. Instead, they appeared sleek, with bubble canopies and heavy wing-mounted armament. Flying in disciplined groups at high altitude, they moved faster than any American fighters Sakai had previously encountered. In response, every available aircraft in the Tokyo defense sector was launched. Around 150 Japanese fighters took to the air, including Zeros as well as Ki-84 Franks, Ki-61 Tonys, Nun-K interceptors, and Ki-43 Oscars, virtually the full range of Japan's remaining fighter types. Yet by April 1945, Japan's air arm had declined sharply. Fuel shortages limited flight training, and new pilots graduated with minimal experience. Early war aviators often logged hundreds of hours before combat. By contrast, replacements in 1945 sometimes had only 40 to 70 hours total. The highly trained veterans of the opening campaigns had largely been lost, leaving inexperienced pilots to face increasingly capable enemies. The first clash occurred shortly after 11:15 a.m. As both sides converged over Tokyo Bay, Japanese pilots soon realized they were confronting an opponent unlike any they had previously faced. The escort fighters, identified as P-51 Mustangs, demonstrated speed and performance that seemed beyond reach. Whenever Japanese aircraft attempted to engage, the Mustangs could simply accelerate out of range. With a top speed around 437 miles per hour, the American fighters held a decisive advantage over the Zero. In aerial combat, that difference translated directly into survival. Sakai attempted an attack on a Mustang that appeared slightly separated from its group. Diving from above to gain speed, he closed in and fired. His cannon rounds missed as the American pilot spotted the threat, made a brief turn, and accelerated. Even at maximum dive speed, Sakai's aircraft could not keep up. The Mustang climbed away effortlessly. For Sakai, it was a shocking encounter, an enemy fighter that could outrun him with ease. Similar encounters unfolded across the sky as Japanese pilots found themselves unable to maintain contact with their opponents. American tactics took full advantage of their aircraft's strengths. Rather than turning tightly with Japanese fighters, Mustang pilots used speed and altitude to control the engagement. High-speed diving attacks were followed by rapid climbs to reset position. Short bursts of fire from optimal range were preferred, and pilots avoided prolonged turning fights. The result was a pattern repeated across the battle. Japanese fighters tried to force maneuvering engagements, while American pilots refused and instead struck with fast, controlled passes. One example involved Captain Felix Scott of the 46th Fighter Squadron. Spotting 3 Zeros below him at about 15,000 feet, he dove, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. He targeted the trailing aircraft and opened fire from several hundred yards, scoring hits that produced smoke from the enemy's wing and engine. Rather than staying to turn with the remaining fighters, he used his speed to climb back to higher altitude. The other Zeros could not follow. From above, he prepared for another pass, recognizing that the Mustang allowed its pilots to determine every phase of combat: when to engage, how to attack, and when to withdraw. Major James Tapp emerged as one of the most successful pilots in that mission, employing classic high-speed attack tactics to claim multiple victories. His gun camera footage later drew close analysis. It showed a consistent pattern: approach quickly from above or behind, fire from effective range, then break away and climb before the enemy could respond. Japanese aircraft, lacking comparable speed, struggled to retaliate. While the escort fighters battled above, the B-29 bombers pressed on toward their targets, facing intense anti-aircraft fire but less organized fighter resistance. The Mustangs had disrupted Japanese formations before they could mount coordinated attacks. Any attempt to intercept the bombers was met by diving escorts, forcing Japanese pilots either to disengage or risk destruction. The protective strategy worked as intended. The bombers released large quantities of incendiaries over Tokyo's industrial areas. The aerial fighting itself lasted only about 15 minutes, but its outcome reflected the shifting balance in the Pacific Air War. American pilots reported more than 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with additional damage claimed. Japanese defenses, including fighters and anti-aircraft guns, managed to shoot down 2 P-51 seconds. The encounter underscored how far the technological and tactical landscape had changed since the early years of the conflict. Another pilot was lost during the operation when mechanical trouble forced him to abandon his aircraft. The overall exchange rate in the air was catastrophic for Japan: more than 10 Japanese planes destroyed for each American fighter lost. Most striking of all, only 3 B-29 bombers were brought down by enemy action, an unusually low figure for missions flown without fighter cover. Yet the most significant outcome was not numerical but psychological. Japanese aviators who returned to base were unsettled and discouraged. They spoke of encountering a new American fighter faster, more heavily armed, and somehow able to reach Japan from bases hundreds of miles away. The implications were severe. If US fighters could accompany bombers all the way to Tokyo, Japan's aerial defense network was effectively compromised. There would be no secure airspace left for regrouping or for training inexperienced pilots without the threat of American air superiority. The flight back to Iwo Jima proved nearly as demanding as the combat itself. Many of the pilots had remained in their cockpits for more than 6 hours and were both physically drained and mentally exhausted. Fuel readings were alarming. Several aircraft had less than half an hour of fuel left when the island finally came into view. The small volcanic outpost, barely visible at first, seemed like salvation. One after another, the Mustangs lined up for landing. Landing gear lowered, flaps extended, engines throttled back, they touched down on the rough runway and rolled to a halt. Pilots climbed out with unsteady legs, aware they had accomplished something widely considered impossible. Ground crews crowded around them with questions. Had they reached Tokyo? What did they see? How did the Japanese respond? What was it like to fly such a distance? Most airmen were too exhausted to answer in detail. They had just proven that American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Japan itself, a development that would alter the final phase of the Pacific War. At that moment, however, their immediate needs were food, water, and sleep. Intelligence officers moved quickly, prioritizing information over comfort. Detailed debriefings began at once. Pilots were questioned about fuel usage, aircraft performance, enemy tactics, and the strength of Japanese defenses. Gun camera film was processed and reviewed. Victory claims were checked against multiple eyewitness accounts. Data from this mission would shape all future operations. The key conclusion was simple: ultra-long-range fighter escort was viable. Fuel calculations proved reliable, aircraft functioned as intended, and pilots were capable of enduring missions lasting 8 hours or more. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan had entered a more destructive stage. For Japanese planners, April 7, 1945 signaled a turning point. Their belief that single-engine American fighters lacked the range to reach the home islands was no longer valid. Within days, intelligence identified the new aircraft as P-51 Mustangs operating from Iwo Jima. Reports from China and Europe were reviewed, and captured documents were studied. The findings were troubling. The P-51 was not merely another Allied fighter. It was among the most capable aircraft in service anywhere, and it was now operating over Japan in significant numbers. Japanese engineers examined the Mustang specifications with growing concern. It combined speed, range, firepower, and maneuverability in a way their own aircraft could not match. Its Packard-built Merlin engine delivered roughly 1,695 horsepower at emergency power, while the Zero's Saburo Sakai engine produced about 1,130. This gap translated into clear performance advantages. The Mustang could climb faster, fly faster, dive more effectively, and operate at higher altitudes than any Japanese fighter then in service. External fuel tanks drew particular attention. American pilots could travel long distances using auxiliary tanks, discard them before combat, and still retain enough internal fuel for the return journey. Japanese versions were less effective, often fragile, prone to leaks, and in limited supply. As a result, Japanese fighters remained restricted by range and design choices that favored maneuverability over endurance. After early encounters with the new aircraft, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai recorded his impressions. He noted that the American fighter surpassed the Zero in nearly every measurable way except low-speed turning ability, and American tactics prevented Japanese pilots from exploiting even that advantage. The Americans had faster aircraft, stronger engines, heavier armament, better communications, and, most importantly, the ability to operate over vast distances. Japan, he observed, was defending its homeland with aircraft designed years earlier, while facing the most advanced fighters in the world. Without major changes, he believed, the air war could not be won. The consequences went beyond individual aircraft performance. With fighter escort now available, B-29 bombers could operate at lower altitudes and with greater accuracy. Earlier missions had required high-altitude bombing to avoid concentrated defenses, reducing effectiveness. Now bombing runs could be more precise, more concentrated, and more disruptive. Japanese cities became increasingly vulnerable. By mid-April 1945, additional American fighter groups were fully operational on Iwo Jima. Alongside the original unit, they provided more than 150 P-51 seconds for operations. Missions quickly intensified. Another large escort mission to Tokyo took place on April 12, followed days later by independent fighter sweeps, including attacks on airfields in Kyushu. Each raid deepened the psychological strain on Japanese forces. American fighters could appear with little warning and over widely separated locations. Combat reports from Japanese pilots began to reflect a reluctant respect for the Mustang and its crews. They noted disciplined tactics and effective coordination. American pilots avoided turning engagements where Japanese aircraft might hold an advantage, instead using speed to control the fight. They operated in mutually supporting pairs and relied on superior aircraft performance. Courage alone, many reports concluded, could not offset such technical disadvantages. The disparity in training and resources further widened the gap. By 1945, American pilots entering combat often had between 300 and 600 flight hours and extensive gunnery practice. They were trained on modern aircraft by experienced instructors and were well versed in formation flying, communications, and emergency procedures. Japanese replacements frequently arrived with only a few dozen hours in the air. Some had never fired weapons in aerial practice or rehearsed combat maneuvers. Young, minimally trained pilots were being sent against highly prepared opponents. American logistical strength also became increasingly evident. Airfields on Iwo Jima were expanded continuously, with construction crews lengthening runways, building maintenance areas, and establishing fuel storage facilities. Replacement parts arrived regularly, and new aircraft were flown in from other bases. Maintenance could be carried out with proper equipment and sufficient spare components. Engine replacements could be completed within days, and readiness rates remained high despite harsh conditions and intense operational tempo. By contrast, Japanese maintenance and supply systems had largely broken down by 1945, further weakening their ability to respond. By the final year of the Pacific War, Japan's aviation system was collapsing under severe shortages. Replacement parts were scarce to the point of near absence, leaving aircraft parked for extended periods over minor mechanical issues. Engines frequently malfunctioned because the synthetic lubricants available were of poor quality, while fuel stocks were often tainted by contaminants. Airfields themselves lacked proper support equipment, forcing ground crews to improvise repairs in open areas, sometimes while under enemy attack. Operational readiness dropped dramatically on paper. Units appeared stronger than they were, yet in reality fewer than 2 out of every 3 listed aircraft could take off. Many of those still flying were outdated machines kept in service long after their intended lifespan. By 1945, the situation with aviation fuel had deteriorated sharply. Allied submarines had sunk large numbers of Japanese tankers and destroyed refining facilities, leaving remaining fuel supplies both limited and substandard. Pilots complained of engines running unevenly, breaking down prematurely, and producing less power than expected. High-octane gasoline required for peak engine output was effectively unavailable. As a result, Japanese fighters often operated well below their designed performance levels. Meanwhile, American aircraft, especially P-51 Mustangs, received a steady supply of high-quality 100-octane fuel transported across the Pacific without major interruption. U.S. pilots could therefore push their engines to maximum output using emergency power settings, whereas their Japanese counterparts had to handle their aircraft gently just to keep them operational. With the arrival of late spring 1945, long-range escort missions from Iwo Jima became routine. Weather permitting, Mustang units flew several major operations each week. Each sortie yielded more combat film, more victory claims, and growing proof of American control of the skies. Japanese aircraft losses climbed steadily. By the end of May, the 3 P-51 groups based on Iwo Jima had reported more than 70 aerial victories, along with numerous enemy planes destroyed or damaged on the ground during strafing attacks. The mental strain on Japanese pilots intensified. Before even taking off, they understood the disadvantages they faced: inferior aircraft, limited training, unreliable maintenance, and poor quality fuel. Still, they were ordered to challenge bomber formations guarded by large numbers of modern American fighters. Predictably, casualties mounted. By late May 1945, a newly assigned Japanese fighter pilot's survival was often counted in missions rather than months. Many were lost on their first combat flight. Veteran aviators such as Saburo Sakai survived through exceptional skill and growing caution, but even they recognized the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. On May 29, 1945, one of the Pacific War's largest air engagements took place. More than 450 B-29 bombers, escorted by roughly 100 P-51 seconds, launched a massive daytime incendiary strike against Yokohama. Japan responded by sending up about 150 fighters drawn from all available units. The resulting clash filled the sky with hundreds of aircraft locked in chaotic combat. Despite overwhelming odds, Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with determination. One particularly aggressive flyer managed to shoot down Lieutenant Rufus Moore of the 45th Squadron before being shot down himself. American pilots later spoke with reluctant respect about how this unidentified Japanese pilot maneuvered through the escorting fighters before finally being overwhelmed. The battle highlighted both the strengths and limits of American escort protection. Although nearly 100 Mustangs guarded the bomber stream, determined Japanese attacks still damaged 175 B-29 seconds and destroyed 5. American fighters claimed 26 enemy aircraft in return. Even so, the exchange ratio strongly favored the United States. Japan's losses could not be replaced, while American losses remained manageable. A mathematical imbalance that shaped the remainder of the air war. June 1, 1945 became known among Iwo Jima-based Mustang crews as Black Friday. That day revealed that the greatest threat to American pilots was not always enemy aircraft, but the Pacific itself and its violent weather. A formation of 148 P-51 seconds departed on an escort mission to Osaka under forecasts suggesting only moderate cloud cover. Instead, they encountered a massive storm front about 370 miles north of Iwo Jima, rising from sea level to more than 23,000 feet. Attempting to push through towering thunderstorms, the formation broke apart in severe turbulence. With visibility nearly zero, several aircraft collided. Others were forced into uncontrolled dives or spins and crashed into the ocean. Some pilots, disoriented by the storm, wandered off course until their fuel ran out. By day's end, 27 Mustangs had been lost and 24 pilots killed, none due to enemy action. The 56th Fighter Group, operational for just 2 weeks, lost 15 aircraft and 12 pilots in a single day. It became one of the worst non-combat aviation disasters in the Pacific theater. These long-range missions revealed a sobering reality. Japanese fighters remained dangerous, but statistically they accounted for relatively few American pilot deaths. Weather, navigation errors, mechanical issues, and fuel exhaustion caused far more losses. Between April and August 1945, the U.S. 7th Fighter Command lost about 180 P-51 seconds in Pacific operations, with fewer than 30 destroyed by Japanese fighters. Most were lost to operational hazards, including crashes at sea after running out of fuel. The Pacific itself proved to be a vast and unforgiving environment. To support these extreme missions, a sophisticated rescue network was established. Submarines stationed along flight routes acted as recovery vessels, while destroyer escorts patrolled designated zones. Amphibious PBY Catalina aircraft conducted search operations and could land on open water to retrieve downed airmen. This system proved highly effective. Roughly 60% of pilots forced down in the Pacific during these missions were rescued. One example was Lieutenant Frank Hayes of the 15th Fighter Group, who was saved twice. The first time, he bailed out more than 400 miles from Iwo Jima after mechanical trouble and was picked up by a destroyer. 2.5 months later, after engaging 3 Japanese fighters, he parachuted into the ocean again, this time so close to a rescue submarine that he barely needed his life raft. By July 1945, air operations over Japan had changed significantly. Japanese fighter resistance declined as the remaining aircraft were increasingly held back in anticipation of an Allied invasion of the home islands. Rather than lose them in futile dogfights against superior American fighters, Japanese commanders chose to conserve their dwindling air strength for planned kamikaze attacks against invasion fleets. As Japanese aerial resistance weakened in the final months of World War II, many P-51 Mustang sorties met little or no opposition in the skies. With fewer enemy fighters to engage, American pilots increasingly turned their attention to targets on the ground. Airfields, factories, and infrastructure became primary objectives. These low-level attacks, however, carried their own risks. Flying at very low altitude exposed Mustangs to dense anti-aircraft fire, and in some respects these missions were more hazardous than traditional dogfights. Japanese anti-aircraft crews improved their accuracy over time, learning to anticipate the speed and path of fast-moving fighters. Mustangs often swept across airfields at roughly 350 miles per hour, firing their heavy machine guns into parked aircraft, hangars, and support facilities. In response, Japanese gunners filled the sky with flak bursts and streams of machine gun fire. Many American aircraft returned to Iwo Jima bearing damage from these attacks, and some were lost altogether. Despite the dangers, the campaign proved highly destructive. Between April and August, 1,945 P-51 units operating from Iwo Jima reported destroying or damaging more than 1,000 Japanese aircraft on the ground. Although wartime claims were frequently overstated, captured Japanese records confirmed that these attacks severely crippled what remained of their air forces. Aircraft that escaped immediate destruction were often left in such poor condition that they could never fly again. One airfield after another was systematically neutralized. Japan attempted to adapt to the growing Mustang threat, but its options were limited. It lacked the industrial capacity to build fighters capable of matching the P-51's performance. Months of strategic bombing had devastated manufacturing facilities, and what production continued often focused on outdated designs. Pilot training also suffered. Fuel shortages meant fewer training flights, leaving many new aviators underprepared. Supply lines were disrupted by Allied submarines, and Japan could not replicate the logistical reach of the United States. Facing an opponent with superior technology, training, and numbers, Japanese air defenses steadily collapsed. By August 1945, resistance in the air had largely disintegrated. On August 10, P-51 seconds based on Iwo Jima flew what would be their final major combat sortie of the war, engaging Japanese fighters near Tokyo. The 15th and 56th Fighter Groups claimed 7 aerial victories. 5 days later, Japan surrendered, bringing the conflict to an end. From early April to mid-August 1945, Mustangs conducted 51 major missions over the Japanese home islands. They escorted large numbers of B-29 bombers, carried out independent fighter sweeps, and struck ground targets. In doing so, they secured overwhelming American control of the air over Japan. Operational statistics reflected this dominance. P-51 seconds assigned to the 7th Fighter Command were credited with destroying 206 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat during this period, accounting for the majority of Mustang victories in the Pacific Theater. The 15th Fighter Group achieved the highest total, followed by the 21st and then the 56th, which arrived later and suffered heavy losses earlier in its deployment. 5 American pilots flying from Iwo Jima became aces, including Major James Tapp, who reached that status in April after downing his 5th enemy aircraft. American losses during the 4-month campaign amounted to roughly 180 P-51 seconds. Fewer than 30 of these were shot down by Japanese fighters. Most were lost to operational causes or ground fire. In air-to-air combat, the exchange ratio strongly favored the United States, exceeding 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American loss. The performance of the Mustang, combined with superior tactics, training, and numerical strength, left Japanese pilots at a significant disadvantage. When Japanese aviators did score victories, they often relied on extreme and costly tactics. For those Japanese pilots who survived, encounters with Mustangs over their homeland left a lasting impression. In post-war reflections, some acknowledged the overwhelming technological and industrial superiority of the United States. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most famous surviving aces, later described the P-51 as fast, powerful, and heavily armed, with a range that allowed American pilots to strike deep into Japan and return safely. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, were limited by fuel shortages, aging designs, and inexperienced crews. The disparity in resources and technology had become impossible to ignore. Beyond its combat performance, the Mustang symbolized the scale of American industrial power. Its mass production, the development of long-range fuel tanks, and the establishment of advanced bases far from the American mainland demonstrated the logistical reach of the United States. Sustained operations across the Pacific underscored the depth of American resources and planning. This realization weighed heavily on Japanese military leaders, reinforcing the sense that their capacity to resist was nearing exhaustion. By mid-1945, the difference between the two nations' aviation industries was stark. In 1944 alone, American factories produced more than 96,000 aircraft, including over 12,000 P-51 Mustangs. Japan's output that year was far lower, around 28,000 aircraft of all types, and many of these were outdated or built under deteriorating production conditions. Quality control suffered, and some aircraft were barely fit for service. The imbalance in production, technology, and training ultimately ensured that American airpower would dominate the skies over Japan in the final months of the war. By the final year of World War II, Japan's industrial base was in freefall. Sustained strategic bombing and severe shortages of raw materials had crippled production. Many manufacturing plants were destroyed outright, while others were broken up and relocated into caves, tunnels, and scattered facilities in a desperate attempt to survive air raids. Under such conditions, consistent manufacturing standards became impossible. Aircraft leaving assembly points frequently suffered from poor alignment, inferior materials, and unreliable systems. At the same time, the United States had developed the most advanced pilot training pipeline of the war. American aviators moved through a layered system: primary instruction, basic training, advanced training, and operational preparation before being assigned to combat units. They trained on several aircraft types, learned to fly by instruments, practiced gunnery extensively, studied tactics under seasoned instructors, and typically arrived at the front with hundreds of flight hours. Japan's situation by 1945 stood in stark contrast. New pilots often received limited time in outdated training aircraft. Ammunition shortages meant gunnery practice was rare, and the number of experienced instructors had dwindled after years of heavy losses. Many new aviators were sent into combat with only minimal preparation. Fuel shortages made matters worse. American B-29 bombers and submarine operations had destroyed refineries and decimated Japan's tanker fleet. By mid-1945, the country possessed only a small fraction of the aviation fuel needed for sustained operations. What remained was frequently contaminated, causing engine failures. Training missions were cancelled, combat sorties reduced, and many aircraft remained grounded for lack of fuel even as American fighters flew overhead freely. The psychological impact was severe. Japanese forces still had planes and pilots, but not the fuel to use them effectively. When P-51 Mustangs appeared over Tokyo in April 1945, their presence symbolized more than just another enemy aircraft entering the theater. They represented the full weight of American industrial mobilization and Allied strategy. Each Mustang embodied an enormous logistical network: factories operating around the clock, abundant aluminum and oil supplies, extensive training infrastructure, trans-Pacific shipping routes, advanced engineering, and refined tactical doctrine. The aircraft was a product of a vast industrial system concentrated into a single fighter. Japanese pilots understood the implications. Seeing Mustangs cruising at high altitude over the capital was a visible reminder of the imbalance between the two nations. The belief that determination alone could overcome material superiority rang hollow. Differences in speed, firepower, range, and reliability were measurable and decisive. For civilians, the message was equally clear. If American fighters could reach Tokyo without effective opposition, then no part of the home islands was beyond reach. Official assurances about Japan's defensive strength lost credibility as enemy aircraft appeared daily overhead. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed what many had already recognized. By the summer of 1945, American air dominance over Japan was complete. Strategic bombing had crippled industry, submarine warfare had choked off resources, and Allied numerical and technological advantages ensured that Japanese air forces could not seriously challenge American operations. The P-51 played a key role by escorting bombers deep into Japanese territory, enabling devastating attacks on infrastructure. This outcome carried a certain irony. Earlier in the war, Japan had fielded one of the world's most capable fighters. The Mitsubishi A6M0, introduced in 1940, combined exceptional range and maneuverability with adequate firepower and initially dominated the skies of the Pacific. For more than a year, Zero pilots achieved remarkable success against Allied aircraft. However, Japan struggled to produce effective successor designs quickly enough. Modifications pushed the Zero's design to its limits, but by 1945 it remained essentially a pre-war concept facing far more advanced opponents. American aircraft development, meanwhile, advanced rapidly. The P-51 reflected mid-war technological progress, more powerful engines, improved metallurgy, better integrated systems, and innovations such as external fuel tanks that extended range. The gap between a 1940-era fighter and a 1944-era one proved decisive. Japan's inability to maintain technological and industrial parity highlighted deeper economic constraints. As supplies of critical materials dwindled, Japanese manufacturers substituted lower-quality alloys, recycled components, and even wood in some cases. Performance declined accordingly. In contrast, American aircraft production benefited from abundant high-quality materials and stable supply chains. Consistency in manufacturing and fuel quality remained intact. Training systems reflected the same imbalance. Early in the war, Japan had produced highly skilled pilots, but as veteran aviators were lost and fuel became scarce, training standards declined. Fewer experienced instructors were available, flight hours were cut, and replacements were rushed into combat. This created a downward cycle. Poorly trained pilots suffered heavy losses, increasing the demand for new pilots who had even less time and fewer resources to prepare. The United States faced no such limitations. Fuel supplies, instructors, and training time remained sufficient to maintain high standards. The presence of long-range American fighters over Japan also shaped strategic calculations about a potential invasion of the home islands. Japanese leaders recognized that if bombers could be escorted across the country without meaningful resistance, any invasion would occur under overwhelming American air superiority. Air attacks on landing forces would be minimal, and naval units would operate with far less risk. This realization contributed to the broader understanding among Japanese leadership that continuing the war offered little chance of military success. With their air defenses unable to protect cities or industry, and with invasion likely under such conditions, the path towards surrender became increasingly unavoidable. The dominance of the P-51 Mustang was one of several pressures that led Japan toward accepting defeat in the final months of World War II. In the decades that followed, aviation historians and military analysts repeatedly placed the Mustang among the finest fighter aircraft ever produced. Its blend of speed, long-range, durability, and combat effectiveness set a benchmark for fighter design. The aircraft continued serving in multiple air forces into the 1952nd, saw combat again during the Korean War, and later appeared in counterinsurgency operations well into the 1982nd. Even today, a number of Mustangs remain flyable, preserved by collectors and displayed at air shows as symbols of a pivotal era in aviation. For the pilots who flew these aircraft on long-range missions from Iwo Jima to the Japanese home islands, the Mustang represented far more than a machine. Their sorties stretched the limits of endurance and technology. Missions lasting up to 8 hours over open ocean and hostile territory required unwavering confidence in the aircraft. That trust was rewarded. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines ran smoothly for hours on end, fuel delivery remained steady, hydraulics performed dependably, and weapon systems functioned when called upon. Every component held up under extreme operational demands. This consistency reflected the high standards of American engineering and manufacturing. The aircraft had been designed and built with precision, and it delivered when conditions were most severe. Japanese pilots confronting the Mustang experienced the conflict from the opposite perspective. Many remembered the realization that their once formidable Zero fighters had fallen behind technologically. They saw American aircraft accelerate away effortlessly and recognized their own limitations in speed, range, and firepower. Fuel shortages often forced them to break off pursuit, as their planes lacked the endurance to chase enemy fighters back to distant bases such as Iwo Jima. The shock intensified on April 7, 1945, when American single-engine fighters appeared over Tokyo itself, something Japanese intelligence had considered impossible. That moment exposed a profound miscalculation by Japanese planners. Military leaders in Japan had not expected American engineers to perfect large, reliable drop tanks that could extend fighter range to roughly 1,600 miles. nor had they anticipated the scale at which high-power engines and advanced fighters could be produced. The rapid capture and development of Iwo Jima into a major airbase within weeks further undermined their assumptions. Time and again, American industrial capacity and technological innovation surpassed Japanese expectations. Operational statistics from the final months of the war illustrate this imbalance. Between April and August 1945, Mustang units based on Iwo Jima flew around 2,800 sorties over Japan. They shot down more than 200 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and destroyed or damaged hundreds more on the ground. They escorted over 1,000 B-29 bombing missions, achieving success rates above 95%. American losses during this period totaled roughly 180 aircraft, with fewer than 30 attributed to enemy action. The remainder were due to operational hazards in one of the most demanding environments imaginable. These results demonstrated clear air superiority. Exchange ratios and mission outcomes confirmed that long-range fighter operations had achieved their strategic goals. The broader lesson was unmistakable. In wars between industrialized nations, victory often depends on the ability to design and manufacture superior equipment in large numbers. Japanese aviators displayed bravery, and their early war tactics and aircraft designs had been effective. Yet these advantages could not offset the growing gap in technology, production capacity, and training. The Mustang embodied the convergence of advanced engineering, reliable production, sufficient resources, and skilled pilots operating within sound tactical frameworks. Against this combination, Japanese fighter forces had no practical counter. The April 1945 appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo marked the beginning of a rapid decline in Japan's air defense capability. From that point forward, American fighters operated over the home islands with increasing regularity and diminishing resistance. By August 1945, American aircraft effectively controlled Japanese airspace. This air superiority enabled the strategic bombing campaign to proceed with devastating effect. B-29 bombers could operate with fighter escort, allowing them to fly lower and more accurately. Japanese cities suffered extensive destruction as a result. When atomic bombs were later delivered, they encountered minimal aerial opposition, in part because American fighters had already swept most Japanese interceptors from the skies. These operations reinforced key principles of modern air warfare. Bombers require fighter protection. Performance characteristics such as speed and range are critical. Pilot training matters greatly, and sustained industrial output is essential for prolonged conflict. For Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, witnessing American Mustangs over Tokyo symbolized a turning point. Though he continued flying until the surrender, he recognized that Japan's chances of victory had effectively vanished. Confidence in technological superiority gave way to a sober assessment of American capabilities. Observing the silver fighters circling far from their base, he understood that Japan had entered a conflict with an industrial power whose resources, engineering expertise, and production capacity were beyond its ability to match. The presence of P-51 Mustangs overhead carried both military and psychological consequences. They represented not just individual aircraft, but the full weight of American industrial strength and operational reach. The realization that enemy fighters could roam freely over the homeland eroded morale among both military personnel and civilians. As evidence of technological and numerical inferiority accumulated, hope diminished. That erosion of confidence, combined with physical destruction, helped push Japan towards surrender. The pilots who flew Mustangs from Iwo Jima secured a lasting place in aviation history. Their missions tested endurance, skill, and aircraft reliability to the limit. They pioneered long-range escort operations that reshaped air combat doctrine. Superior equipment played a crucial role, but it was complemented by rigorous training, discipline, and determination. Together, these factors produced decisive results: American air dominance and the collapse of effective Japanese resistance in the skies.